there's a problem I have with representation, right? Particularly in a country like India, we've discussed this. Some of the leading figures of the queer movement are not the most progressive people you want representing you in the corridors of power. And the way things are going, they will be the people representing you in the corridors of power.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't care whether the person who's talking about queer rights is lesbian, gay, trans, bi, from the community, not from the community. I care about whether they're advocating for my rights effectively.
So, in your opinion, it's not that important to have queer politicians, but it's important
It's
to have.
important. It's important to have queer politicians, right? That gives you a role model, that gives you a sort of way forward for other queer people who think this profession is not for them. But that's not the solution to the problems. That's one nice thing. Like, we should have queer people in Bollywood, we should have queer people everywhere. But the solution to getting rights is the same as the solution to getting rights for any other citizen.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think if you sort of fragment that into saying that only queer people can advocate for queer rights, you're going to run into trouble.
Hola and welcome to the Queer Podcast, where we look at contemporary issues facing us queer folks. And I chat with a young queer achiever to learn what the mindset of the younger demographic is and how they understand issues that we are facing. So 2024 has been our big election year. It's important for us as a community to vote candidates that are empathetic to our cause and who factor our rights into their manifestos. And who better to enlighten me than the politically astute, charming and invested bright young thing, Anish Gawande.
Oof. Thank you very, very much for it.
Namaste, Anish, and thank you so much for taking time off from creating important databases, jet setting around, missing more than a few flights, I read, to be with us.
Thank you very, very much for having me on the show. Very excited to talk politics, queerness, and more.
And very excited to have you here because I'm sure that I'm going to come out of this with a lot more than I knew walking into this. So thank you. So Anish is a writer and translator. He was always keen on a he.
Yes,
I should ask
he,
your
him.
pronouns.
Yes, he, him pronouns.
He, him pronouns.
Correct.
Always keen on a life in policy making. He is a Rhodes Scholar, holds postgraduate degrees in intellectual history and public policy from Oxford University.
What I do with them in politics, I don't know, but degree to chapke ban
But
gayi.
Oxford University, matlab,
what?
every
Who
mother in
cares?
this country must be thinking, mera beta Oxford
No,
jayega.
you please come to Girgaon with me. Nobody cares about Oxford. They're like, Adnav ka hai.
Where am I? And he's also the director of the Dara Shikoh Fellowship, which is an interdisciplinary arts residency, and most importantly, is one of the founders of Pink List India, which is India's first archive of politicians who support queer rights and
Indeed.
don't support queer rights,
Correct.
as the majority are. So, not just an ever smiling, charming little cutie. Here's a combination of brightness, political awareness, and a little bit of a party animal, I'm told.
A little bit. when one is taking a break from all the politicking. But politics is one big party after all. So,
Okay. Clever play on words. Okay. So, Anish, please tell us about this journey into politics. Where does it begin? How do you get interested as a young person in something where there is no role model for you in terms of Indian role models? And another big sub-question that I have is, did you need to factor in your own coming out if you were setting off on this path?
Ashish, I think there was always an inclination to be involved in doing good in some way, shape, or form or the other, right? I think I was always someone who was debating, participating in sort of like public speaking competitions in school. And I was like, I'll become a lawyer or an IAS officer or a bureaucrat or be a politician. And I think very early on, I realized that I was very gay. And I also realized that all of these avenues would become infinitely harder if I came out.
Correct.
So for the longest time, I was in the closet, fully aware that I was queer, fully aware that in some ways there was nothing bad about it either. I think there was, in a strange way, a point I'd reached where I was smart enough to know that this was not immoral, this was not wrong.
Correct.
But this was simply just not
Accepted.
viable if I
Right.
wanted to pursue the life I wanted to pursue. And I said, well, you have to make a choice. You're either going to do politics or you're going to choose your queerness. And with that thought, I went to do my undergrad in the US. I was at Columbia. I was there. I Stayed in the closet for an entire year in New
In
York City,
Colombia.
in Colombia, in New
In
York
New
City,
York?
in New York. And it is the
God.
biggest wasted year of my
Yeah,
life. I'm
waste of
like,
a
what
year.
have I done? And in hindsight, I'm like, what went on? And I went to the campus therapist and I said, I want your help to stay in the closet. As a
Wow.
very matter of fact thing. It was not like, oh my God, I'm so It's like, no, like now this is getting a little too much. Like I'm like having to navigate this, so you must help me figure this out. And she very sweetly, she's been my therapist ever since, God bless her, was like, yes, of course, we'll work on it. And then as these things go, it was quite obvious that you can't stay in the closet forever. And we said, let's try it out. Let's put this sort of like fear to rest.
Ah.
My biggest fear was I would go on Grinder and my photo would come on the front page of the Times of India.
Huh.
This megalomania was there from the
FOMO.
beginning. Correct. I was like, I'm narcissistic. I was like, who cares, yeah? Like, bloody 5,000 people on Grinder. But I'd never met queer people before then in Bombay. You know, I grew up here, I went to school here, but never really met queer people.
Right.
And so we decided to come out where I knew nobody and nobody knew me, which is how I ended up in Paris on a
Okay.
grant to work at the Indian embassy in Paris. And
Wow.
that's where I came out because I knew nobody, nobody knew me. And there I kissed a boy and I liked it. And then there was no going back.
You know, it's kind of weird. It might sound very alien to you, but even when I was now, what, 30 plus years ago, when I wanted to become a director, I had the same dilemma that there were no queer people in who I knew were directors or producers or actors or whatever in media. And I thought I would have to choose between my career and my
But
sexuality.
you became that person, Ashish. And I think, we met recently also. And I think this has been the wonderful thing about having sort of intergenerational conversations, that you realize that you really aren't alone and that these
Absolutely.
experiences, the other day we were with James Ferreira, and you realize that these experiences really transcend
Yep.
generations.
Yep.
And for me, that moment was when I came back and took a gap semester from college and said, I have to figure out whether I can come back to India, and worked with Parmesh at the Godrej India Culture Lab. And
Fantastic.
for the first time in my life, I saw an out queer person in arguably one of the most well respected organizations in the country being very proud of himself, bringing his whole self to work, as corporate lingo would have it,
Right.
and killing it.
And killing it.
And that, I think, was the sort of gentle nudge that I needed to be like, okay, maybe you can be out in India. And I wasn't certain that I could be out in politics in India. I was like, okay, I can
Right.
be out and come back to India and maybe do something else because I always wanted to come back.
Right.
I was very clear that if I had to stay in the US, I would, but
Right.
otherwise, not really.
Nice.
And
I
then,
really respect that actually.
and it was always like, I love, it's just,
Home.
yeah, and I would love going abroad. Like,
Sure.
I enjoyed the education I got, but I was clear I was coming back. And then 5 days before graduation, I got a call from Milind Deora,
Ooh.
who's someone I'd volunteered with on his 2014 campaign when he ran, and who I'd stayed in touch with, who called me up and said, will you run my campaign?
Wow.
And I said, I'm very out and in New York City. And he's like, so? And that was the motivation I needed. And I said, you know what? I've got your backing. Screw this. Screw the US. I gave up my OPT, my 1 year work authorization, all of that. 3 days after graduation, I was on my next flight out to Bombay and jumped headfirst in outfits very much like these with brown Oxfords, white linen pants, and like a new shirt every day
Dressing the
on the
part.
campaign trail. And
Amazing. Amazing.
I haven't looked back since.
I just hope you are the vanguard of queer people who get into politics
But
from
I'm
now on.
not because we've had queer people in politics before. I think what has happened is in the moments between the early 90s,
Right.
when you had people like Namdev Dhasal, etc., who led the Dalit Panthers
Right.
and created sort of like Dalit queer solidarity, to the sort of advent of the court battle against 377, we've seen the fight for queer rights move from the political arena to the courtroom.
Right.
And as much as I value and I treasure everyone who's fought in the courtroom, and I think that was an important fight, I think along the way we've forgotten that that cannot be the only avenue we fight within.
Right.
And I think that 2013 to 2018 moment, when we were in between 377 moments,
Correct. Back
was a
and forth.
very powerful one because so many people were like, screw this, we're going to do work in the corporate sector. People like Parmesh, people were doing work in the education sector.
Sure.
People like you were doing work in film and cinema saying, you know what?
Yeah.
Fine, law's the law, we'll take our own course.
Right.
And that's where the idea of Pinkless and the idea of working for queerness in politics was also born, that regardless of what the courts do. And we find ourselves in that moment today, right? With
Again,
marriage
yes.
equality and with a lot of other issues like horizontal reservations for transgender persons. If the courts aren't going to do anything, we can't just sit silently.
Right.
That battle has to continue. Now, the battle in politics will take much longer,
Sure.
um, but you can't abandon it. And I think so. Queerness has been political, and I can only hope that there's a lot of people now getting invested in that idea. And I count them as friends. There's Disha Pinky Sheikh, who's with the Vanchit Bahujan Aghadi.
Right.
There's people like Apsara, who switched a few parties
Correct.
around,
Correct.
but been rising up the ranks in
Correct.
politics. There's
Correct.
Akkai, who's done amazing work with the Congress in
Absolutely.
Karnataka. So I think
Absolutely.
there's a few people who are shaking up the system a
Yeah,
little bit.
it's kind of interesting that a lot of them are transgender, but we'll come to that
We
as
will.
well.
I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Pink List India, and I thought it's absolutely fascinating. I popped into it a few times. So I see a lot of merit in what you've done in terms of curating and. But what made you think of creating this pink list? And also, I know that it consists of a few sections. There's trailblazers, change makers, allies, outspoken allies. So, how did you come about this idea that let's create a web online database where people can actually see how supportive or not supportive their candidates are?
So, the idea came about again before the 377 verdict by the Supreme Court. I had
Okay.
just come back from New York to Bombay. I
Right.
had gone to Milan, and he was like, Acha, election hasn't heated up in Bombay yet. You go work with Ashok Chavan, who was heading the Maharashtra Congress at the time,
Right.
for 6 months on this Janasangharsha Yatra across the state. And so
Wow.
here was this bichara Bombay boy who's thrown across to Hatkanangale and to Beed and Latur and to every single part of the state on this massive yatra. And I remember we were in Pathardi, which is on the outskirts of Ahmednagar. And there was a journalist I was having a conversation with who was telling me about her experiences with Raju Shetty, who
Ah.
was a farmers leader from Hatkanangale, who had been asked about queer rights after the 2013 verdict,
Right.
after the 2009 verdict.
Okay.
And he'd said, I'm a farmers' rights leader. Of course, I support queer rights. Otherwise, that would be hypocritical. And on the campaign trail, I started noticing because I was like slowly and selectively coming out in bits and pieces that there was a greater acceptance for queerness than one would originally have assumed.
Right.
Now, bear in mind that I come as a upper caste, upper class gay
Privileged.
man, right?
Vagera, vagera.
And I also come with like one hand of Milind Devra plus Ashok Chavan on top. So it's like a little like whatever
Blessings.
kavach that you need in politics, nobody is going to mess with you.
Right.
But despite that, I could see that there was a lack of vitriolic hatred,
Right.
right? Which
Right.
I had assumed would be the case. And there
Right.
wasn't a
Oh, you were
dismissive attack.
prepared for like.
I was prepared for that, right? And I think that was the fear that this is going to be impossible. And that's the case in many other parts of the world today, right?
Sure.
Including in the West, like in a place like Poland, I think it's harder to campaign for gay rights in politics in Poland, where the right wing has instituted gay free villages and things like that. But that kind of rhetoric hasn't entered here yet. And I think
Yet.
that was the
Yes.
fear, right? And so I realized that there's more support than you would assume, and that it was important to hand out bouquets while we were hanging out brickbats. And I think that desire became even more entrenched after the Supreme Court verdict in 2018,
Right.
because a lot of politicians came out in support.
Correct. No,
And I
that
said
did
that,
happen.
what do we do with now? I know 35 MPs who openly supported LGBTQ plus rights. How do we mobilize them? How do we create some sort of way in which to create a pressure group in the highest corridors of power?
Right.
And so that's where the idea of the pink list was born. And we said, let's track candidates running for office and let's give voters the ability to know about the positions of their candidates on all issues. So if I
Fantastic.
know your opinion on the economy, if I know your opinion on like whether or not the potholes on my road are going to get fixed or not, if I know your opinion
The
on
answer is no.
no, but I mean, now that the politician is demand like if the politician goes for a meeting, those are the questions that are raised.
Right.
So why can't they be asked about queerness?
Absolutely. I never understand how we have queer leaders in the community, no names, gatekeepers who have spent their lives fighting for queer rights, but at the same time have biases and very clear public opinions on caste, religion, etc.
But I think
Negative
it's-
opinions.
But I think it's you have to understand that queerness is just one of your identities, right?
Right.
And in an environment where your other identities are politicized to a far greater degree than your queerness,
Right.
queerness doesn't become your dominant identity on both sides of the political spectrum. And that has its advantages and disadvantages,
Correct.
right? Because it's not politicized to the largest degree, we don't face the kind of sort of vitriolic hatred that spurred a sort of Ronald Reagan moment in the US, right? Where people were taking to the streets in vast numbers to protest against the government and its actions against queer people in the face of the HIV epidemic,
Correct.
right? At the same time, the lack of that, if it depoliticizes your movement, also protects you in some way because you're not on anybody's hit list. You're
Correct.
not, no
Correct.
politician is going out and saying, हमें gay लोगों को India से निकालना है, तो vote for us. Yet, touch wood.
Yet.
And that's one of the main things that Pink List also does right now, right? Monitors whether that discourse is changing. So you want to be an early warning system in case that discourse is
Do you
changing.
see that changing?
We had a little bit of a flurry around the marriage equality case.
Correct.
That was my biggest worry. We were on the ball, tracking every single MP, every single politician, every single statement. There was one brief bit in Amravati where a politician, an MP at the time, and still an MP, had made a speech about ये लड़का लड़का शादी करने वाले लड़की लड़की शादी करने वाले क्या हो रहा है देश को. And that was a kind of rhetoric we haven't seen because we have the database of what everyone has said over the past 10 years now, right? Over the past 5 years directly, but
Correct.
also their past statements. And we hadn't seen that become a sort of
Magnified.
rally issue. Support has also never been a rally issue.
Correct.
Politicians who put up tweets will not go to a sabha and say, we support LGBT people.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Except a
Unfortunately.
few trans politicians who managed to go on stage. So Disha goes with Prakash Ambedkar to rallies, etc. But by and large, nobody is taking a public stance on queerness. So that's kept you a little shielded. But I think the fear is that it's a very precarious position where it can go either way very quickly.
Right.
Where the minute a political party realizes that we can use fear mongering around queerness to sort of
Rally.
get votes, that's it. So
And the
that's-
world is going right.
and the world is going right. And the idea is, as much as I might hate to say it, and as much as my political persuasions are completely contrary to this, it means engaging across party lines to ensure that safety valves are present to be like, hey, don't go there.
Right.
And I don't know whether that's going to work for very
Hold.
long, but I think that's the only viable way to ensure that queer people who are not like us, right? We'll flee at the first sign of trouble, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And I will
Shrieking.
certainly be fine,
Yeah.
right? Like I can leave, like chalo Columbia gaye, Oxford gaye, to political asylum bhi mil jayega. But you're not going to have that for a vast majority of queer people who don't have those privileges.
Of course.
And who we've told that you can now come out because the world's a better place. Right? So, in a sense, there's also that sense of responsibility that which I don't know, might have been similar to 2009 to 13, right? Where so many people came out.
Yes.
And then 2013, the court is like,
Yeah.
having sex is criminal again.
Yeah.
And it's fine for the people fighting who've been criminal earlier also.
Right.
But for the people who came out in
Yes.
2009,
Yep.
that's terrifying. Like
Yeah.
now suddenly I'm like, I took this huge bet. My government's now against me. My court is against me. What do I do?
Yeah, there was a deer in the headlights moment for a lot
Yeah.
of people who got emboldened to come out, and then suddenly it was like, eek, now we're out with pink flags. And
And we had to ensure that people like you and people like Parmesh were like, no, we're still going to be publicly out and we're still going to give these interviews and we're still going to be proud of our queerness. So you don't have to worry.
right.
And I think that's what we're also going to try and build against, regardless of what political party is in power, regardless of which direction the political winds are blowing. I think queerness needs to be positioned in such a way that one, queer rights are acknowledged as human rights, and that it doesn't matter whether queer people are voting for you or not, or whether
Correct.
queer people are a voting bloc or not.
Right.
Because there's not enough out people. But we have to ensure that queer people are going to be given rights on the basis of the principle of those rights being justified.
And it's human rights.
Exactly.
So in my 20s, queer folk were clearly taboo politically. There was absolutely no mention. I'm talking about 30 odd years ago, right? There would be no hope of even mention of this demographic. Although, if we use a common yardstick, we are 10%, which roughly crosses 135 million people, right? A rough, bad estimate. That is staggering. Now it's a bit of a changed escape, and we could definitely be seen as a vote bank.
I disagree there. Yeah.
Okay.
See, I'll tell you the
Please tell
problem
me.
is, again, like we discussed earlier, there's members of the queer community who hold opinions that you would think are contrary to their queerness.
Right.
Right? So queerness is not the deciding factor when you are making your choice of whom to vote for.
Okay.
So you're not a vote bank because you're not voting on the basis only of your queerness.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And you shouldn't either.
Right.
Secondly, yes, 10% of the country is queer, but how many of them are out?
One.
Right? And of those who are out, how many will that influence the voting of? And of those who are out, how many of them are concentrated in one place? Bandra, I would argue, is the
Your
next
biggest
Castro. It's like the
demographic.
Castro of. I've been asking people to do this all the time. Like everyone's like, when are you going to become a politician? I'm like, you move to Bandra first, and I'll fight from Bandra. That's all the people are here.
I think you enough of a vote bank in Bandra.
But you have to no. But see, logically, a community that is much smaller than the queer community, but geographically concentrated, has more value for a politician.
Correct.
1% spread across the country is meaningless.
Yeah.
If they were concentrated in one city, one state, one region, even 5 constituencies, your leverage becomes significantly higher. Right? Then people are taking you seriously, people are coming to you. Today, we have to go to the politicians and be like, please, hamari suno.
No, you're absolutely right. I
But
didn't think of it that
But
way.
what I think is changing is that queer people in the country, paradoxically, unlike other minorities, unlike Dalits and Muslims in this country, because they've been systematically deprived of their rights for so long,
Correct.
queer people, because they come out later and queerness is sort of distributed evenly across the population,
Correct.
come with disproportionately higher social, cultural, and economic capital.
Right.
You have queer billionaires, you don't have Dalit billionaires in this country. And that's a reality. And the question is, how do you mobilize that now? Right? How do you ensure that that social, cultural, economic capital translates into good for the entire community?
Right.
And that has to translate into political capital. Where we
Right.
need people who are queer in the highest echelons of power to be using their queerness to advocate for the community at the highest levels. And there are lots of them doing this, right? That if you're going to enter into a meeting and a politician is coming to you to get a significant chunk of money for their election, which a lot of queer people are in positions to do,
Correct.
you ensure that they also support your agenda.
Right.
You and I know lots of queer people who own very successful businesses.
Correct.
They have to negotiate with the local politicians. If you're a builder, if you're a restaurateur, you have to deal with your sort of local MLA, corporator. Forget about your MP. Deal with the local ones first.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I didn't see it that way. I think just basic, what I thought common sense. Oh, but we are a big number. But you're right. It's so diffused, diluted, and spread out.
But you have the leverage to work separately. You have the leverage of the media. Outsized influence in Bollywood today, if you ask me.
Yes.
Despite numbers, because of a few people who made change.
Yeah. And Bollywood did a lot for sensitizing
Correct.
in their own bizarre way.
But I'm seeing a very small number of queer people, one of them being you, have done that in Bollywood, right? Because you have to realize that you can pull some levers that others can't.
Right. Right.
And then ghusa,
Yeah. Correct.
which is
No,
what needs
you're
to
right.
happen in politics.
Wow. Okay, what are our actual rights as LGBTQA folks? What are, so from what I know, there are no legal restrictions anymore against gay sex or gay expression, right? And to think that I lived almost 5 decades with the possibility of being criminalized.
Not like it stopped you.
I mean, a little bit. No, I had privilege, a lot of privilege, right?
Yeah.
Same-sex couples have some equal cohabitation rights. They have what are known as live-in relationships. However, India does not provide yet for common law marriages, same-sex marriages, civil unions, or issue partnership certificates. Big issue, right? The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019 recognizes the right to self-perceived gender identity and identification documents indicating gender as male or female or other can be issued by government agencies. But the catch over there is that the certificate has to be provided by a relevant medical officer, which is contentious,
Correct.
right? Transgender citizens have a constitutional right to register themselves under a third gender, which is actually a big
It's a huge move.
Yeah. Additionally, some states protect hijras, a traditional third gender population in South Asia, through housing programs, medical benefits, welfare benefits, pension, etc. There are approximately the 2011 census, which is now 12 years,
Yeah.
13 years old, said that there were approximately 5 lakh transgender people, which now obviously
Yeah.
has increased. But again, I'm not so sure how it can be monitored.
So those are not accurate, right? I mean, it's ridiculous to assume that there are only 4 lakh trans people in India. The
Correct.
census has not acknowledged trans people because a lot of trans people are hesitant
Yes.
of showing the census authorities their sort of one, they didn't have ID cards in 2011, right? So trans
Correct.
people would be marked on the basis of whatever ID cards they held.
Right.
So if you're a trans woman with an identity card that said you were male, the
Male.
census would still mark you as a male.
Correct.
So in many ways, there's a massive undercounting that has happened of trans people, which
Right.
needs to be corrected with the upcoming census.
Right. Which, I worked a lot in Sri Lanka at one point doing advertising. A smaller country with predominantly one or two languages have a social security number. They are countable.
Yeah.
So it really makes a difference to the sort of dynamics of a country, right? Whereas India is so unwieldy in a sense.
But it's not, right? I think it's India's unwieldy when you only think of the top. Right? When you think that any change in policy has to come from the central government, yes, that's going to take decades, if not longer. Change at the lower level happens much quicker.
Okay.
Right? And if you sort of piece together, you asked what are the rights that queer people have and what they need. So today you have the right to live with the person who you want to live with, and the courts will uphold that choice. Remember that you still will have to go to a court to get that choice upheld. It is not going to come to you automatically if somebody disputes it. You have the right to have sex, but that's pretty much all you have. We don't have protection from discrimination yet. If somebody fires you for being gay, you have no alternative or no legal recourse.
Unless
You can go to court, and the courts have upheld it in judgments earlier, but that could take long. And who has access to that kind of justice, right?
Unless you're protected by corporations now, like Godrej and all, that have policies.
Absolutely. But you're at the mercy of a very small clutch of corporations that account for a minority of India's workforce, of which almost 80% is in the unorganized sector, right?
Right.
So how do you sort of get discrimination, anti-discrimination becoming a key cornerstone? I think the other rights, including the right to health, right? I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that ART centers across the country were being transformed into COVID wards. Now, can you imagine that people living with HIV who are going to get life-saving ART treatment are going to a space that is next to literally the most infectious place in the country at the time in an already immunocompromised state? It makes no sense. And it's because you don't have policy making at the highest level that acknowledges that these should not be put together. Now, with Pinklist, we managed to reach out to a few politicians. There were a couple of groups. We managed to connect them to politicians as well to ensure that those are not converted into COVID wards. And that's a common sense approach that the municipality is taking, right? So your sort of civic commissioner, for example, in Pune, was taking that decision, not the union health minister. Now, getting to the union health minister is going to take some time.
Yeah, decades.
But these levels of changes are easier to make at the local level.
Yeah, you're right.
You now have government hospitals in Bombay providing you with gender affirmation surgery. And that's happened through engaging with the sort of hospital authorities at the lower level and being like, listen, Ayushman Bharat covers this, so you should cover it too. The policy change can happen at the national level, and we'll push for that. But its implementation requires sustained engagements at all levels of government.
I want you to become prime minister. Let me just say this. Yeah.
बना दो, Bandra
And
से
I
पहले
hope
खड़ा
I
कर देंगे.
live to see the day. Internationally, we have a lot of politicians. We even have prime ministers who've been queer.
Listen, I'm not a, and I know you said I should become prime minister. I don't mind. I really enjoy the house.
Yeah.
But, it's beautiful. Like, I changed the...
See, your gayness has come up.
But I joke, but I also say this because I think there's a problem I have with representation, right? Particularly in a country like India, we've discussed this. Some of the leading figures of the queer movement are not the most progressive people you want representing you in the corridors of power. And the way things are going, they will be the people representing you in the corridors of power.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't care whether the person who's talking about queer rights is lesbian, gay, trans, bi, from the community, not from the community. I care about whether they're advocating for my rights effectively. Let me give you an example, right? For this election that we just saw, you had a lot of parties including queer rights in their manifesto.
Right.
And a lot of dear friends of mine have worked on these manifestos. I think they've done incredible work on them.
Absolutely.
What was the consultation process for these manifestos? Who was asked?
I didn't get a call.
I didn't get a call.
Shockingly.
You know,
Yeah.
must
Yeah.
complain
Yeah.
to the manifesto
Yeah.
committee. But you know, these are not like politicians cannot treat LGBTQ plus rights as a charity, and you cannot see LGBTQ plus rights as something that only some people represent. Because the reality is, you're not going to get like 500 queer politicians tomorrow, no? So until then, I'm not waiting. I want to ensure that if a politician like Raju Shetty, who says, I'm a farmers' rights leader, if I don't support queer rights, that's hypocritical. I want politicians like that. I want
Yes.
politicians, you know, someone like a Supriya Sule,
Yes.
who I have met multiple times in the past. And we met with the deputy CM at the time, who's the deputy CM again, because Maharashtra politics is one round merry-go-round. We met Ajit Pawar, and in 5 minutes, the Trans Welfare Board for Maharashtra was sanctioned, and a LGBTQ plus helpline for queer people was sanctioned as well.
Wow.
Helpline is not materialized. Trans Welfare Board is materialized with a 5 crore budget. Now, that's also been lost in the politicking of the day. But you know, you need access at that level from politicians who are willing to take up your fight and who are willing to listen to demands, not requests.
Right. So, in your opinion, it's not that important to have queer politicians, but it's important
It's
to have.
important. It's important to have queer politicians, right? That gives you a role model, that gives you a sort of way forward for other queer people who think this profession is not for them. It's one of the reasons I'm in politics. I think I would have liked to see someone like myself a long time
Absolutely.
ago. But that's not the solution to the problems. That's one nice thing. Like, we should have queer people in Bollywood. We should have queer people everywhere.
Yeah, it's a benefit.
It's
Bonus.
a opening up of access where you should not be discriminated against if you want to get into politics. But the solution to getting rights is the same as the solution to getting rights for any other citizen,
Absolutely.
right? And I think if you sort of fragment that into saying that only queer people can advocate for queer rights, you're going to run into trouble. And in fact, I would say that you need to build up enough political capital to be able to go. And this is why I like politics, right? Because, and which is why I don't like the courtroom. Because in the courtroom, you go with a request, you go with a petition. I'm petitioning Judge Sahab. In politics, I go with a demand.
Ah, okay.
I'm not going to a politician saying, Mujhe please ye kar do. I'm like, no, you bloody do this, or I won't vote for you, or I will not support you, I will not extend my support to you. And when you transform those sort of rhetorics from requests to demands, you open up the floor. In a courtroom, you ask for one right at a time.
Correct.
You know, you go, acha, abhi mujhe marriage chahiye. And that's the biggest debate that happened in the marriage equality case was like, oh, should we do marriage first? Should we do something else first? That's what happens when you get stuck in the courtroom. I want to go in a political sphere where I present a manifesto or a sort of charter of demands. I want to combine those demands with other marginalized groups, with demands raised by differently able people, by demands raised by environmental activists, by minorities across religion, caste, and gender, who are then going to be able to say, all of our demands are one.
Yeah.
And
I love how you're setting right my naive. Oh, we are a vote bank. Oh, we need.
But you know, that rhetoric we've been so used to now, and I think we have to also, there's such little political education because queer people, because I was not out till much later, was still in the sort of cishet rooms
Right.
with men
Yes.
discussing politics. Most queer people, or if you're a femme gay man, or if you're like not into the sort of macho stereotype, are not part of those discussions. At the dining table, you're not going to be part of those conversations. And so automatically, and this is the big problem with women in the country, right? And that's changing dramatically now.
Dramatically.
But women have been excluded from political discourse. So how do you become a political citizen if you've been left out of political discourse? It's what's happening to trans communities across the country. Incredibly well organized community.
Yes.
Very sort of politically relevant,
Yes.
but left out of political discourse from a young age because most trans people get thrown out of their homes, which means that they don't have the ability to organize politically, which is where solidarities are important. Namdev Dhasal recognized this. He went to Kamatipura and said, I will work with sex workers and with trans folks and create a charter of demands and march to Sharad Pawar's house in the 1980s and managed to leverage that political capital. We need that because we have to acknowledge also, right, that queer people have gone through a lot of shit.
Yeah.
You can't expect a queer person to also know everything about politics.
Yeah, of course.
You're
So
first sorting out
also
your
not
own
a
life.
priority for.
Exactly. So, political education is step number one, and then political action. And I think that'll happen slowly. But it can't be predicated on this misguided notion that you're a vote bank.
Correct. No, you're
Because then,
absolutely
then
right.
it means you're going to come to us. Nobody's
I'm
coming to
sorry.
you. No, but because it's also, I see it a lot with queer people. I'm like, you really, I mean,
Think. Yeah, no,
pardon
no,
my
it's
French,
absolutely.
but तुम्हारी औकात देखो. Like, you are not a vote bank. Nobody's coming to you. Nobody's begging for your vote. You need to mobilize and do some work before you get attention
Yeah.
politically.
Yeah.
This is not.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad to now know this and to understand this now. Okay, so picking up on what you said, we actually have had transgender politicians,
Yeah.
right? Strangely, we've had minor victories mainly from that community. So Shabnam Mossi was
Yes.
the first trans woman MLA. Madhu Kinnar, who is Dalit, won in Chhattisgarh in 2015 and was the first trans mayor. Apsara Reddy, who you mentioned, is the first trans woman to hold office in the Congress as the National General Secretary of the All India Mahila Congress,
Yeah.
which is pretty epic.
Amazing.
Yeah. And there have been about 5, 7 other transgender individuals who are in the AAP and in the Bahujan Samaj Committee, right? So isn't it odd? And what does this say about us as a community?
No, exactly what I told you earlier, right? What separates the trans community, particularly the Hijra community, right? These are individuals who primarily come from the Hijra community or depend upon the Hijra community for their political support.
And their structures.
Geographic concentration
Correct.
and regional sort of separation, right?
Right.
And a strong sense of community in a very organized way.
Correct.
So there is a Hijra Gharana,
Yes.
right? 5 Gharanas coming together gets you 4, 8, 10,000 votes. Politician has to come to you. Leading politician in South Mumbai, who you would not expect to be very queer friendly, uh, will be the most trans friendly politician because his constituency has Kamatipura in it, and a large number of the sex workers in Kamatipura are trans. You can't ignore.
Amazing.
When my vote margin is 55,000 to 70,000, those 2,000 extra votes are a very big determinant.
Difference maker.
The second thing is, trans identities are the most visible and the most persecuted.
Yes.
Trans people have to fight for their rights because otherwise they're going to get thrashed by the police. They're going to get fined by your BMC guy for being a sex worker. And they're going to have to navigate and negotiate the system. You and I don't have to do that.
Right.
We have
No,
to be
they have to
comfortable.
fight for their existence.
Correct. You and I are comfortable in our house. If you're in a relatively successful, like sort of safe and comforting family, you're fine. For trans folks, that existence is predicated upon engagement with politics. You have to be able to navigate and negotiate with the police. You have to be able to navigate and negotiate with a local politician. This is again where your local trans people are not going to become, not going and sending their demands to their MP.
Right.
They know how to go to the corporator. They know how to go to the Shakha Pramukh of the party who's in power over there. They know how to work their ways around those systems. And so that allows you to build political capital and then allows you to also stand for elections, right? Someone like a Shabnam Mossi, also, these are again things that depend upon a lot of other factors. Now, both Shabnam Mossi and Kamla Jan, who was the first to become a municipal councillor, did not become MLAs or councillors because they ran on a trans platform. Shabnam Mossi ran on a very anti-right-wing platform.
Oh, really?
She ran against the BJP and criticized all of the right-wing parties and said, I am the sort of progressive candidate, and brought this under an umbrella of issues. So she became a sort of left candidate in that front, right? So her trans identity was not even relevant in as much as it sort of erased her caste identity. So it was an election where there were two dominant castes fighting against each other, and she was the one that everyone could get behind because there was caste concentration in two hands, where she became I will work for all castes. Right? So there's a very important caste calculus that took place over there. Other trans politicians who managed to succeed as well have sort of had to navigate their multiple identities and a political platform that is more expansive than just trans rights. I think we can see that happening with other parts of the spectrum.
Yes.
We have not had a single gay, lesbian, or bisexual person elected to public office.
Correct. Out.
Out gay, lesbian,
Yes.
bisexual person. Not to municipal councillor, not to MLA, not to MP, not to anything. Not even
Right.
to state board.
And I mean, the elections we've just been through, for example, they used
Zero. No one won.
but election icons were transgender people, like Shane Soni,
Correct.
who was Miss Transgender in 2020, was used in Delhi, even though she had a lot of issues. They do use trans.
And the government has been very vocal about its support for trans rights, right? Because it's politically expedient for them.
Do you think it's also because it's a part of our ancient culture?
This
and
I don't buy. This is all very nice. You can invent ancient culture when you want to. It was the same ancient culture that was used against us in 377. So this chakrawing around ancient culture, I don't believe in.
Right.
Even if queer people are becoming queer people by choice, as long as they're not harming anybody, why are you criminalizing existence or not giving rights? I
No,
don't buy this.
absolutely.
Because queer people existed in ancient culture, if they didn't exist then, you shouldn't be
No,
giving rights.
because if you look at our spectrum, somehow the transgender people in India are, in some ways, easy. There's more comprehension and easier processing.
That I agree. So there's been a longer, again, right, like idea of community organizing. So, for 400 years continuously, you've had gharanas exist. So there's a way in which that acceptance is not about, and Maya Sharma writes about this beautifully, right? And she talks about how lesbian identities in Gujarat, in rural Gujarat, are recognized because they manage to interweave themselves with local custom and tradition. I want to shift away from the ancient to the negotiation of the local.
Okay.
It's not about whether they existed for 1,000 years or what happened in Khajuraho. Whatever is depicted in Khajuraho, lots of that is not allowed even today. Bestiality is also there. That doesn't mean bestiality was socially acceptable. Things on the temple wall have never been seen as something that is applicable to normal mortals. That's like saying everything in the sort of like Greco-Roman tradition that happened on and on is acceptable for normal
I mean, if you
society.
come to my place on a Saturday night,
It's
you'll
I'm
see some
waiting for this
interesting
invented.
tableaus.
I'm waiting. But this is again ancient Indian tradition. If you're saying was queer friendly, we were a deeply patriarchal society. Do you think women were allowed? Women were not allowed to choose their partner. You're saying that women were allowed to be queer. We were very
Yeah.
casteist society, which meant Dalit people were not allowed to love across their caste.
Yeah.
How can you say there was queer liberation in ancient India and that's
Yeah,
why we
no.
have
No, I
acceptance now?
meant queer recognition of the Hijra transgender community.
But in a very peculiar way, right? Where was the Hijra trans community recognized? And that continues to today. Begging, sex work, keepers of the harem. You've reduced the trans and Hijra community to these three professions historically. In fact, I would put the conversation back and say, no, actually, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Where it's socially unacceptable for a Hijra person to actually be successful and do something else.
Right.
Right? And people are breaking that. There's the trans salon that started now, there's the trans cafe that started now in Bombay. Those things are changing, but you'll see there's much greater pushback against those initiatives than even the initiatives brought in by the government, which are like, we'll give handouts. Because societally, trans people are still seen as charity cases. And that's where people like Shabnam Mosi and others have broken across that stereotype and said, no, we'll create these wide arching solidarities and manage to put power back in our own hands. I think queer people need to do that. It's harder when you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, because I think in many ways those are not as legible as identities.
Correct.
In the
Also
popular
visible.
mainstream. They're not visible either, right? And those get you a certain degree of skepticism. I think they come with a very large perception of you being the urban elite.
Right. A
which has been-
Western
Yeah,
influence.
correct. Western influence, urban elite, that's what the sort of discourse has been, even the courtroom around marriage, right? And so those become significant hurdles to your sort of political advancement. Um, but to be very honest, I think until now, most people who came out as lesbian, gay, bisexual came from positions of privilege.
Absolutely.
They didn't need
Absolutely.
to get into politics. They didn't need to fight to become politicians for their survival. You can't have that fire in your belly if you're comfortable. You can't do the kind of work that it requires if you're comfortable.
You're
And
right.
you're seeing that change now because people across levels of privilege are coming out. And I'm certain that in the next 5 years, we'll have somebody from who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual elected to office. Because these will be candidates who will be taking their own identities to the polling booth and saying that no, we're actually working for a wide cross section of people. You might also see candidates who are saying we'll align with the dominant political force in the country and get elected, but that's politics.
Right. That is politics. Right. Tell me, where are you going to go from here? What, because I'm very keen to see what happens with you.
What is Anish going to do?
What is
Who knows what
Anish
Anish
going to
is going to do? Yeah, Anish is writing, faffing around. I faff around. This is my full-time job is faffing around. I love having fun. And I love putting my hands in multiple pots and like contributing wherever I can. And I see myself doing that. I don't
But do you see yourself ever running for?
see, you never ask a politician this question. Yeah, wo bhi hum dekhenge. If I was in a political party, I would say if the party wants me to contest, I will
Yeah.
contest.
If they insist that
If
I
they
become
insist, I will
PM,
serve.
yeah.
Correct. I will serve if the party asks me to. As someone who's not affiliated to a political party, I see myself working in helping a lot of others get to that stage. Whether or not I contest will entirely depend, to be perfectly honest with you, on a range of factors, right? Politics is about the right moment and you being in the right place at the right time. You can't choose, you can't sort of engineer it. It's not a profession where you work in it for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, you'll achieve some form of
Right.
success.
Right.
It's the time has to be right, the place has to be right, the sort of arithmetic beyond other factors, your caste equation, your sort of socioeconomic position, the language you speak, the area you're in, the political moment you're in, all has to be right for you to even consider contesting. For now, one is taking a more cautious approach, and
Right. Tell me just a thought that struck me on the personal level. How does this sit with your family?
they are most accepting of me being queer. They are most befuddled by me being a supporter of the left. I come from a very right-wing conservative Maharashtrian family, so they are all very confused. They're like, "Kya karte Congress sobat kaam kar?" They're all very, very confused.
But are they comfortable with the fact that your queerness is very out there? It's a
Yeah, my parents came. I was giving a lecture at Maharashtra National Law University here, and they came and sat in the audience very sweetly. They're a little confused. They don't really grasp at all the nuances, but they'll come, support, cheer on.
sweet.
When Pinkless started, my article came in the Times of India right next to Shobha Day's article, and I still joke with Shobha. I'm like, "You're Shobha Day, I'm Shobha Gay." But I came in the Times of India with this massive headline: "You're told you can't be queer, and in politics that needs to change."
Right.
This interview with my big
I've
thopda.
seen that.
And it was really funny because all the relatives were calling up because National Edition Times of India, Nagpur se phone aa raha hai, everywhere they're calling, "Ka chal hai?" And they were very like, haha, yes, of course. And
So there's no like, listen, tone down the.
no,
You're in. You're.
I think there was definitely a tone down the politics.
Ah, okay,
There
interesting.
was not a tone down the queerness. There was a tone down the politics because the times we live in are tricky. And I respect that advice sometimes,
Yeah.
right? I think
Yeah.
you need somebody who's also giving you that realistic perspective. I love ideals, I love principles, gung ho, but sometimes you need someone to sit you down and be like, listen.
Which you've done with me today, and I have to really thank you for
But
that.
it's now you tread carefully and you do it knowingly, but you do it in a way that is reflective of reality.
Correct, correct. I mean, for me, I mean, the only thing as we struggle with all these issues is, will the parliament ever enact laws that truly reflect inclusivity and diversity, etc.,
100%.
etc. है ना? That for me is the most important thing. And if there was any message in this episode, it was like, just keep voting, keep going
Yes.
out there and voting,
For
whatever.
your BMC corporator, before you vote for anybody else. BMC elections, God knows when they'll happen for everyone in Mumbai, for the other cities that are listening in, you'll know when your local elections happen. Those are crucial, and politically, that's why your vote matters. A BMC corporator gets elected in Mumbai with 10 to 12,000 votes. Maximum. Most win with 7,000 votes, 6,500 votes.
So it's just a matter of getting that number.
It's the matter of getting that number, and it's a matter of saying if you can convince yourself and 100 other people in your area or 200 other people in your area, that BMC corporator will do anything for you. He'll put a bloody gender neutral bathroom in your Sulabh Sauchalay. He'll ensure that your ART center is not shut. He will ensure that HIV tests are done on time at the local hospital. You will then have somebody who can crack the whip
Actually,
on.
yeah.
You don't try and crack the whip on an MP or the Prime Minister. You leave the Prime Minister for now. First, get to your corporator.
Yeah. Anish, thank you so much. It has been very, very enlightening on a lot of levels, which I knew it was going to be. And I love, love, love that you wear this serious academic political hat along with this charming party gay bonnet that you have on all the time, and that you so seamlessly seem to own the two, which
The
is really
shirt just
lovely.
gets ditched at night.
Thank you. You are truly cool. I am truly inspired by you. And I really want to see, like 10 years later, I want to know where Anish is and what Anish is doing.
Fingers crossed. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for
Thank
having me.
you.
Ashish. So lovely. Come. Mwah.